And it's all fixed now. Thanks guys for waiting there. Something strange happened. It's all sorted now anyway. So yes, so we're live on YouTube. So welcome to the March and it's all fixed now. Meetup. Thanks guys for March meetup of the Scottish PowerShell and DevOps user group. Sorry, I had some audio in the background that was distracting me. This month we're actually a little bit early. It would tend to be the last Wednesday of the month that we'd be having the meetup, but this month we are actually having it on the 21st, so it's a week early as I'm not here next week. Can someone just drop me a quick comment in the comment box? Make sure you can hear me okay. They can hear me on YouTube, I know, because that's the audio that's distracted me, but not sure if...
Paul is calling, I can hear you, no problem.
Perfect, thank you very much, thank you. So I know that's getting through then. Okay, so you can hear me on YouTube, you can hear me on the call, that's great. So yes, as I was saying, so we are a week early, and because I'm not here next week, so I thought we would get this done this week instead. So it's been 3 weeks, just over 3 weeks since the last one. The next one will be the last Wednesday of April, and we've also got one in, obviously, in May the 30th. I know that's definitely the date. What's the one in April? I think it's the 25th. Let me just double check. Yeah, Wednesday, 25th April is the next one. The PowerShell Conference Europe happens, I think it's round about the 17th, so it's about a week and a little bit prior to our meetup, so I hope that's not going to cause any speakers or anybody else any PowerShell overload, but we're going to be, as I said, doing that one in April the 25th. I've got a bit of information about the one in May as well. But I'm going to rattle through our usual slides. I just want to go through them. Mathias is waiting. He's going to be doing his talk at 7:15. I see that he's joined the call as well, so we know he's here. And give me just a little second. Cool. Okay, so first slide. So as the usual one, if you've been to the meetups before, which I know most of you have, I'm just going to look at the names. Yeah, most of you have. You'll know these slides, so I'm not going to take an awful lot of time to go over them because you'll have seen them before. They are available on the GitHub repo for the user group, which you'll see at the bottom left there at get.psdevops.ug.scot. But that's our details for contacting the group and for all the information about the group. I'm the organizer. That's my details. That's my Twitter handle. And yeah, there's a website, psdevops.ug.scot. We've got the Facebook group. We've got video through YouTube as well. At the moment, we only have one video on there from it's all the way back last year. All the other ones have yet to go on. It's just one of those things that'll happen. But it's just taking its time. Remember, it's only me that's doing this. We've got the YouTube channel as well, where we do live stream this every month now. We're getting pretty good at getting a few people on. We generally got about a half dozen people on the YouTube channel every month. At the moment, we've got 5 watching, which is good. We've got, how many have we got on the call? We have, I think it was 9. So we've got 14 people, so that's quite good. So yeah, so we've got the call details there as well. We've got a new URL, maybe makes it easier to get the call details, and it's call.psdevops.ug.scot. It's the bottom right hand corner. So there's all our details there. You can get all the information. All of the slides or links to the slides for every meetup you will find on GitHub, and you'll also find it on the website. Add them there now as well. So we're also part of UK-wide groups, as I've said many times. We have the London PowerShell and DevOps user group. That's much bigger than ourselves. They now have 5 organisers, and that's all of their details there as well. And there's a Southampton PowerShell and DevOps user group, and that's run by Jonathan Med. He has a couple of other people to help him out, including Graham Beer as well. So that's their details there for that. There is also going to be a Manchester group, I believe, starting up again. I've not heard any more about it other than it was probably going to happen. So I've heard no more details from there, but hopefully that will kick off as well. And you'll find details of all the groups there as well. So tonight's agenda is general, welcome, the introductions, and me chit-chatting for 10-15 minutes. And obviously fixing the YouTube channel for 5 of those. We've got Mathias coming on, and he's going to speak to us about .NET and the common type system. Mathias was supposed to be chatting to us last month, but unfortunately, if you all remember the terrible weather, he got caught up in that, so unfortunately, he wasn't able to attend. So thankfully, he's able to attend this month, so we'll be able to hear from him shortly. And we're going to have a 5-minute break, so we don't get PowerShell overload, and then we're going to listen to Christopher. He's going to talk to us all about PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer. He's actually a community maintainer for PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer. I was actually chatting to him, I think it was last week, the week before, about a couple of issues I was having with PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer, and he was going through them with me. I have yet to go and create issues for these things that I was experiencing. I will be doing it because I like to feedback when I can, but yeah, Chris is... I hate using the word guru, but I'd say Christopher knows quite a lot about PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer, so we're going to hear from him. If you don't know what PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer is, Chris will go over that a little bit as well. But it's will help you with your code. Once you've coded up all your modules and all your functions and all your scripts, you'll be able to run things like PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer and Pester over them to help you kind of adhere to best practice, and in Pester's case, kind of test and various other things. It'll dig you out of some holes and point out some problems that you might be making for yourself. And then our usual thank yous to everybody after that. So there's a quick overview of the agenda again. So 7 to 7:15, me chit-chatting. 7:15, Mathias is going to speak, and then 8:15 to 8:20, a quick break, and then we'll hear from Chris all about PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer. Now, we've got a venue for the May meetup. We do all these online, as you all know, and it's been going like that for, I think we started in April last year. In fact, we did. April was the first meetup we had last year. And from May this year, we're going to have a location to do physical meetups as well. Now, I'm going to continue streaming this to YouTube if I can, which I should be able to do, but that is certainly my intention. So if you're on YouTube and you think we're just going to disappear, we're not. We will hopefully, as I said, be continuing to stream to YouTube, maybe even film this in the future and be able to put that on YouTube as well. So things are going to kind of change a little bit. We're going to have the venue, as I said, in the new garment factory in Glasgow. That's all been done up, let's say. I think it's a £6 million renovation. So Incremental Group, we're going to be in the 5th floor. They are kindly putting us up in May. And I know that's a big change for some of people because we've obviously been doing this online for quite a while. But I'm going to send out a survey after this meetup, and just to find out, one of the questions is to find out what people think of that. We're going to be looking at doing it from 6 p.m. Excuse me, 6 p.m. Or 6:30. I would prefer 6, if I'm honest. In May, as I said, May the 30th, and we're going to be doing it there from the garment factory. So we'll see how all of that goes. But please let me know what you think about that. Please let me know if that's going to cause you problems. You're not going to be able to attend. I'm hoping, all of you will be able to attend. Even if you're on YouTube, you can't attend in person. Even if you're on YouTube. So that will be going ahead as of May the 30th. I'll put more about that in an email to you later on as well. And finally, I keep this here as basically as a placeholder because this doesn't work. So this link you're seeing on the screen is for the Slack channel. It doesn't work. Please let me know if you want to join the Slack channel, and I can add you in there. Or sorry, send you an invite to add yourself in there. And hopefully we'll get you on there. The Scotland channel is a bit quiet, which is fine. The general channel's reasonably busy. There's a lot of help available there as well. So yeah, it's good to get involved with other people who are doing PowerShell and non-PowerShelly things. Oh, Chris has just told us that that link should be fixed. Okay, there's an actual link. Yeah, there's a link in the chat window for those if you're interested in joining Slack channel. There's a link that Chris has just posted in there. He said that should be fixed. I didn't know that, Chris. I'll have to add that in then, if that is the case. But I understood it was still broken. So hopefully that will work. I will also put that onto the newsletter so that everybody's aware as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shut up because I'm all finished, and I'm going to pass everything over to Matthias if he is ready.
I believe I am. Thank you very much, Paul. How do I share my screen on this?
I'm just going to switch presenter over to you, and you should get a pop-up asking you.
Perfect.
And then you have control from there.
Yes. So I'm just downloading this % module now, and then in a not very PowerShell fashion, it looks like I'll have to click next, next, next a bit.
Okay. The wonders of technology.
Sorry?
The wonders of technology.
Exactly. So while this is downloading and configuring, I might as well present myself briefly. My name is Matthias, as Paul perfectly pronounced before. I've been into PowerShell for almost 10 years. Most of my adult life has been spent fiddling around with it, in both a professional capacity, but also as kind of a hobby. Um, uh, One of the things I find most interesting about PowerShell is, as as was mentioned in the abstract for this presentation, is its ability to kind of glue together many subsystems that exist in Windows. Right, it's very hard to work with or manage Windows without getting into something that needs to be configured with an XML file, without fiddling with WMI, without getting into .NET because it is the primary application platform on Windows. And so having a kind of general purpose glue programming language that you can use to kind of bind all of these things together is obviously a bit of a revolution. And I think we've seen that over the last 10 years that PowerShell has kind of changed the face of how we interact with and manage Windows systems, and now also non-Windows systems. So that's kind of one of the most exciting things for me. What I find when I go out to kind of to conferences, to meetups, or if I talk to people online, is that people find this great, just like I do, but they're having a bit of trouble figuring out like what is this all about? Like what enables all of this glue? What's actually going on under the hood? You know, what is the nature of PowerShell? And so this year, I have the privilege of talking about that a little bit at the upcoming PowerShell Conference, Europe 2018. I think Paul mentioned before, the 17th to the 20th, maybe 21st of April in Hanover. As far as I know, it's not sold out yet. So if you're crazy about PowerShell, which I kind of assume you are if you're on this call, go out and get your tickets for PSScriptAnalyzer. It is, in my opinion, the best tech conference out there. So I'm still waiting for this presenter module to launch.
The software installed okay.
Yeah, let me just see. Oh, something's happening. So, can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Aye.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, perfect. And you can all see the presentation.
Yep.
All right, perfect. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the RTFM. And RTFM, if you've been in the industry of managing servers, deploying enterprise-wide code, the first thing that springs to mind is probably some senior developer or sysadmin kind of arrogantly asking you to read the fucking manual. That's not what this is about. If you're working in InfoSec like me, the next thing that might come to mind is the Red Team Field Manual. It's also not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about today is what I like to describe as a runtime type fiddling for the masses. As I mentioned before, kind of the type system in PowerShell is one of the most fascinating assets for me. So kind of digging in and see how we can fiddle a bit with what's underneath the hood might be interesting. As I mentioned before, I'm speaking at the PowerShell Conference Europe 2018 in Hanover, and this is kind of a prelude to that. I want to kind of introduce this idea of PowerShell having its own type system, dig a little bit into what that is, and then hopefully create a bit of excitement about this quite nerdy topic. As I said, PowerShell Conf for the EU, or PSConf for the EU, best conference in the world in my opinion, so please join us for some PowerShell overload. All right, so on the agenda for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a type system in the context of computer programs, in the context of programming languages. We're going to have a very brief look at
Welcome. This service is provided by freeconferencecall.com. There are 8 participants in the conference. The recording has started.
And what this whole common type, like what is the commonality in this common type system across the systems where you might deploy .NET. And then at the end, I'm going to try to break out PowerShell, and we're going to fiddle around a bit and see if we can kind of put this into real world use. So disclaimer, I have no idea what I'm doing. You might have seen me answering questions online or getting into discussions about this sort of thing. Every time someone comes up to me and asks a question or I encounter a problem that I'm trying to solve, I basically remember something Jeffrey Snover, the shell father, taught me a couple of years ago when I met him the first time. If you ever encounter a problem, if you ever encounter something you don't understand, or something that's too interesting to kind of let go by the wayside, sit down, open PowerShell, and then kind of just explore, just see what you get out of it. And so this means that without being an expert in any subtopic, whether it be PowerShell or any of the systems it interacts with, I found that kind of philosophy has driven me to learn and figure out way more than I could have expected. And I also don't know how to play the fiddle, so please don't get your hopes up on that front. So, what is a type system? When I was a kid and I got into computer programming, or rather I got into computers, I thought they were really cool and I wanted to see what I could do with them. Someone mentioned in passing, an adult who worked in the IT industry mentioned in passing this idea of a type system. I think we're having a discussion about the merits of different types of type systems. And I had no idea what they were talking about. I knew a little bit of HTML. I worked with JavaScript in the browser, CSS, this kind of thing, front-end web development. And in JavaScript, there's not really or at least 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there wasn't really this idea of a type system or a variable or an object in the programming language having a type. It was the thing, right? When you write a function in JavaScript, you just say that it takes one or more arguments. You don't really say anything about what the arguments are or the objects that you might return from a function or a method. So I was a bit confused. What type system? What is that, right? First, I thought it had something to do with typesetting. Maybe it's some sort of ligature carried over from before we had computers. It has nothing to do with typesetting or the printing press. All right, so I thought I'm going to Google this, right? So I Googled it. I Googled what is a type system, and I got into all these journal articles and discussions and forum boards and Wikipedia articles discussing kind of these the myriad of different dichotomies within the context of typing or type systems in programming languages. And they usually took on the form of strong versus weak typing or static versus dynamic typing. And at this point, I was even more confused, right? At this point, and this is a little bit embarrassing today, but at this point, 10, 15 years ago, I literally thought that that strong and weak typing was referring to the act of typing on a keyboard, right? Are you typing really fast and furiously? You must be a strong typer, right? Are you kind of a little bit more subtle? Maybe you're a weak typer. This couldn't be further from the truth, obviously, because the type system are basically the name given to the rules that govern data type in a computer programming or in a computer program. And so, in the context of programming languages, a type system are the rules that govern how data types act and interact in a computer program, in the thing that we're trying to describe with our high-level programming languages. So, okay, what is a data type? A data type, again, in the context of computer programs and programming languages, if you think of anything that you can refer to in memory, using the syntax of your language as an object, right? And an object in this context is very vague and very broad and may refer to some complex business object that represents some logic. It may represent just a string value, may represent a number. It could be anything, right? An object in this context could also be an array or what have you. And the idea, in most type systems at least, is that type or the data type of a thing, of an object, is a core property of that thing itself, right? It's part of the object's identity. It's a little bit different from kind of the things that an object can have. If I have a complex business object, say, representing a football team, it might have a property that is a roster, right? A list of players currently playing for the team. A data type is a little bit different in that I can't really change the data type, right? I can update the roster of my football club business object without changing the nature of the football club business object. But if I start to fiddle with the type itself, kind of the intrinsic identity of this object, it's no longer a football club, right? It's usually being used either at runtime or at compile time as contract for behavior, right? The data type describes the behavior or what kind of behavior that we can expect from an object of a certain type. In many languages, again, depending on the syntax, it might also be a contract for operator behavior. If you think it's a plus as an operator, it has two very distinct meanings when you take the number 1 and then plus and then the number 1 again, versus if you have a string, right? You have the string with a length of 1 that is the number 1 and then plus another string of the number 1. Plus would now mean a concatenation operation, right? We concatenate two strings together and we end up with a string 11. And again, if we did this with two numbers, we would expect a radically different result. The operator would behave differently, simply based on the type of the input that we provided. This concept is also not specific to object-oriented programming, right? This is not this is not specific just to C#, C++, these languages that we find on .NET. This has been a thing, like this idea of having kind of a central rule governing data type and data type behavior goes all the way back to way earlier programming languages. Right. So again, back to the question: what is a type system? Now knowing this, so a type system is very briefly a set of rules that govern types, these data types that we have in our programming languages and the various layers of abstraction throughout our program. And what is the aim of a type system? Well, the aim of a type system is basically to reduce runtime errors. This has kind of been the aim from the start, that if we can say something about how two entities in our program needs to interact, how they can interact, how they can't interact, we're less likely to do something when a user executes that program that results in some sort of faulty behavior, right? If we can kind of guarantee to, let's say, a compiler who needs to compile our code to an executable program, if we can give a set of rules for the compiler to guarantee that nothing that is not supposed to be happening can't happen, well, then there's obviously a way lower chance that something terrible goes wrong during runtime, right? Some of the side effects of this, depending on the language and the framework, might be memory optimization, because a lot of type system rules and type system behaviors aim at being able to not only control but also infer what a type is, and the type of an object obviously also influences the size of an object in memory, right? If you take something like a 32-bit integer, it gets that name because it's a type of integer that can fit into 32 bits. Right? Another side effect is that in more modern languages, and die-hard system engineers will say that even in older languages, this brings about something called reflection. This idea that since the data type is itself kind of a core property or intrinsic to the object itself, we can take any object that we have in memory, any object we have at runtime, and we can have it inspect what it is, right? We can have it inspect the nature of itself. This is pretty cool, and this is basically what powers PowerShell. PowerShell would not have been what it is today, and it would not have the type system it has today, and some of the nice functionalities, like the pipeline, for example, without reflection already being kind of core to the .NET framework. So a type system also usually includes a core set of types that are kind of natively recognized by the programming language that it's designed for. And it may include what we today might describe as extensible types. This idea that you have a data type, you have a contract for how an object behaves, and you can now extend this behavior, right? You can define some new behavior to be to kind of materialize the next time someone tries to create your extended version of a data type. This is exactly what you're doing when you take a feature like PowerShell classes, for example, and then you extend an existing object or an existing class or type that exists either in .NET or in PowerShell, right? Some might argue that it's not actually the type system itself that includes any types in a programming language. The type system is, as I said before, just a set of rules, and kind of these native types that are recognized by programming language or a compiler kind of from the get-go before you start defining anything actually comes as part of the language, right? But semantics. So in different kinds of languages, the type systems differ widely, right? In JavaScript, like I mentioned before, when I started using it, very few people were talking about this. There weren't even this notion that it actually had a type system, which it does. In JavaScript, basically, you have kind of 6, there are probably more, but I know of at least 6 intrinsic types that come out of the box. That is a string, so it could be your name, right? A number, this covers both integers, but it covers also decimal numbers, right? Floating point numbers. You can have a Boolean, just like you have true and false in PowerShell or in any .NET language. You can have an array of objects or of anything else. You can have a function. A function is a type in JavaScript. This is why it's sometimes referred to as a functional programming language. And then finally, you have object. And in JavaScript, an object is a little bit like a hash table. It's like a dictionary-like object that you can basically extend. You can add a bunch of keys to it, and all of a sudden you have an object with properties, methods, as we would call them in .NET lingo, functions that are attached to this object. There are a number of kind of meta languages or supersets of JavaScript that have emerged in recent years. I think TypeScript from Microsoft being a good example, where you try to implement a bunch of extra functionality within JavaScript, so that you can do a class definition like you would do with PowerShell classes or C#. You can define a class structure that's kind of a template, right? It's a blueprint for what an object might look like when you try to create one in the future. But JavaScript doesn't really have this natively, right? You need some other language that kind of implements all of this blueprinting functionality. Perl is another example of kind of a very scarce. I work at Booking.com here in Amsterdam, and it's been described to me as the biggest Perl shop in the world. Most of our code base is written in Perl, and when I talk to developers around me, one of the biggest complaints they have is that they work with this language every day that doesn't actually have a type system, or that doesn't have what they refer to as typed programming. Perl has a number of types. There are more than these three here, but basically the idea is that you keep it very simple, and then the runtime is going to kind of figure out what you want to do based on what you did. But in Perl, by default, you have a scalar, so that's a single object. Could be a number, could be a string. Perl doesn't really care if your number 1 should be treated as a string or a 1. It'll depend on context. You have the idea of an array or a list, so a set of things next to each other. And then finally, you have a hash, again, a dictionary-like object, which kind of forms the basis for most other functionality in this space that we might call type systems. Finally, in modern object-oriented languages like Java and C#, we find something that's a little odd. And basically, instead of kind of a list of built-in types that you can use, there's this one type to rule them all at the root of what we might call the type hierarchy. And in both Java and C# this is called object. The object data type is kind of, as it says here, what everything else extends from. The object in both languages has a bunch of methods defined. So if you wonder how you can, why you can always turn a .NET object into a string, it's because every single object in .NET has a toString method, and this is basically inherited or overridden from this root object. Object implements this toString. It implements a bunch of other methods that has to do with the identity of objects in the runtime. So basically, if I have a reference to an object, can I distinguish it from another similar object? Right? Identity is kind of important to the internal maintenance of any program at runtime. So with this kind of primer, and feel free to jump in and ask questions, or let me know if none of this makes sense. But with this kind of brief overview of what a type system is, or how we might talk about type systems in the context of computer programs, I'm going to do something a little different than what I usually do when I talk about this topic, because usually I take it kind of from the bottom up. Talk about what a type system is, then talk about the .NET Common Type System, and then finally kind of dive into PowerShell. Since you all probably know PowerShell pretty well, and what I really want to talk about is the Common Type System, I'm going to flip the script on this a little bit. We're just going to delve super quickly into what I mean when I talk about PowerShell's extended type system, right? So the extended type system, you might have heard this name. You may also have heard it under the name the adapted type system. I've heard this previously. For good reasons. Recently, most people I talked to, including the product team at Microsoft, seems to accept this description of the extended type system. So this is what I'm going with. But the extended type system in PowerShell, I found a pretty good kind of primer to discuss this topic a couple of years ago. I was at a conference in Singapore, the PowerShell Conference Asia, and just before me, I was presenting about this topic. I was presenting about the extended type system, and I was having trouble figuring out how to kind of lead in, how do you throw people into the deep end, show them something interesting, and then kind of dive into what just happened. And my friend Rob was there. I don't know if you know this guy. He was presenting just before me, and he was talking about profile scripts, right? So these scripts that run every time you open PowerShell.exe or you open the IC or any other shell. You can have these snippets, you can define all sorts of functions, you can set up your prompt, right? And so he was just giving kind of a nice introduction to, what is the profile? Is it personal only to me? Can I do like machine-wide profiles? Kind of just digging into what the profile was when it was run and kind of the internal workings of this. And without even realizing it, he kind of dug into the meat of what I was trying to show. So I'm just going to switch over to just my shell here. I'm just going to make the font a little bigger. Like this. So this is, I think, PowerShell 5.1. I haven't done anything weird. This is just a straight vanilla PowerShell 5.1 with PS readline. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to autocomplete the profile variable. The profile variable contains a reference to your personal profile. As you can see here, this is the profile that's getting loaded from my documents folder.
Mathias?
As you might know, yes?
You've got something on your screen right on top of that. Yeah, it's actually the... Yeah, that's it, perfect. That's it, gone.
Perfect. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Cheers.
So as you can see here, right, when I just go profile, right, try to get the value of that, I get this string back, which is the path of the profile that's loaded for this specific shell for this specific user, right? This is from my documents folder. But so as you know, there are machine-wide profiles as well. You can apply or you can create a profile script that's specific to a shell, so a host application, right? PowerShell DSC, PowerShell IC, and that can also be specific either to your user account or to the entire machine, to all users, right? And so if I click here, right, and I start referencing, I can kind of auto-complete these properties, right? All users current host, all users all hosts, and it gives me a different string value, right? If I check out what the type is, as I said, the type in .NET is kind of intrinsic to an object, right? So any object I have a reference to, I can just call .getType, and it'll tell me the type of this object that I just called getType on. And as you can see here, this is a string, right? Profile is just a string, right? Just like if I create an empty string literal here and go getType. Right. So why does my empty string have an all users all host property, for example? This is kind of weird, right? And if we go on the internet and we search for what a string is, the string class that comes with .NET, we go down here. It says that it has two properties, right? It has the length of the string, right? We can go back and check that. Yeah, my empty string is 0 characters long. And then it has this chars index assessor, as it's called. Basically, it's telling me that I can index into my string, right? So ABC, I can do something like, and it'll give me the character at index 1, and also index directly into the string. But as you can see, there's not any property called all users all hosts, right? So where does that come from? We take this profile and we pipe it to get member. getMember is one of my all-time favorite built-in commandlets. It's going to show you a wealth of information that you never thought to think about in the first place. So what I'm going to do here, and I'm just going to pipe this to getMember. And so you see here, it lists a bunch of methods. You saw that on the documentation for the string class in the first place. Not so interesting. So let me say, I just want member types properties. Right? And so here, what we see is that it does correctly have this length property that we would expect from a string. It also has this parameterized property I showed before, the char, when you can kind of index into the string, right? But then it has these things, these note properties. Okay. What is a note property? The .NET Common Type System itself does not have this notion of a note property. So where is this coming from? Well, some time ago I developed this kind of graphic to kind of dig a little bit deeper into what's going on here. So basically what you see when you're working with an object, right, you have a variable like the automatic profile variable before. It references some .NET object, right? But what you're seeing in PowerShell is not just that. What you're seeing is what is known as a PS object. And the PS object is a type that's basically used as a wrapper around every single other object that you work with in the shell. So kind of transparently to you, any kind of .NET object that you either create, instantiate, or receive from some method in your script or in your shell is kind of transparent, completely transparent to you. It's going to get wrapped in this PS object thing. And this is basically what allows PowerShell's extended type system to attach new information, right? To attach these node properties, for example, to an object without really changing the nature of the object itself. So what happens when, let's say that I want to apply the split operator, right? This is a string operator. It expects me to input a string on the left-hand side, a string on the right-hand side. If I take this $profile -split, and I say I want to split it every time there's a delimiter here, it's going to do that, right? The split operator is going to treat profile just as if it was a normal string, right? So, as it says in the slide here, right? This is all of this information that has nothing to do with the object itself, but is kind of noted by the PowerShell runtime. So these node properties we saw before, these can be accessed directly through something called member sets. And if we go back and we pipe get profile to getMember again, and I wanted to show me all member types of the type member set. Nothing happens. It's not going to show me that, and there's a reason for that. Basically, the PowerShell development team is trying to hide this, right? They're trying to make a nice product that just kind of seems like it works, right? It seems a little bit like black magic. But what we find hidden underneath the hood, if we add the -force parameter here, is that we're going to see these member set members of the profile object. Every single object in the PowerShell runtime that you can refer to, so basically anything you have in a variable, right, like this, like profile, has these member sets attached. And these member sets is basically what makes up the objects that we see in the shell itself. And so if you look here, where it says PS base, basically the definition for the output from getMember here is we see the same thing that we saw on the documentation page on MSDN, right? We have this chars parameterized property, we have the length property, then we have all the methods equals inherited from object. There's the actual method that returns the length when you reference the length property and so on. And then down here, in the member set that's called PS extended, we see these node properties, right, that actually doesn't have anything to do with a string, but is annotated by the PowerShell runtime itself. So this way we can actually go in and we can say, okay, profile.psExtended, if I type that to format list instead of format table, what we're going to see here is that, right, profile is actually made up of kind of a mesh, or as I said before, an adapted view of these two different objects that we've kind of meshed together using this PS object wrapper layer. So PS base that we were looking at before is just your string. You know, PowerShell tries to be helpful here and output a table with all the properties that this object has. In this case, it can only show the length, right? And then the PS extended member set holds everything else, right? Anything that we can't actually store in a string, because a string doesn't have an all users, all host property, is kind of shown here, right? And so when we start working with $PowerShell in the shell or in our scripts, we can have it behave any way we like, depending on context, right? We can pass it to a function, we can pass it to an operator. It'll just kind of grab the base object, and it'll act totally like a string. But if we want to, we can also access all of this metadata by just dereference or referencing this, for example, like you would any other property. So this is kind of cool, and this is kind of where all of this comes from. So if you haven't played with this before, or if maybe in the past you've thought, you know, this is kind of cool, PowerShell is kind of cool, right? It does these weird things, but I wonder how. This is definitely where you want to start looking. I think at the PowerShell conference Europe in Hanover, there's also going to be 2 talks that I definitely recommend you go see. Bruce Payette, it just got announced the other day, I think, is going to go through the history of the architecture of the language and the runtime. And I'm for sure going to be there. I'm sure there's going to be some interesting anecdotes from how some of these decisions were made, right? Like, how do you come up with this kind of scheme? Another presentation at PSConf.eu I'd recommend is Staffan Gustafsson, PowerShell core contributor out of Sweden. He's going to do a talk on this very specific topic. He's going to talk extensively about the extended type system. So if you feel like I kind of muddied this up, or if it was a little too confusing, or we didn't dig deep enough into it, he's definitely your guy. I know he can talk about this for days, and that's a good thing. One more thing I want to mention. A lot of the things in PowerShell that, again, kind of seem like magic, the formatting system, you saw this thing before where PowerShell kind of automatically tries to format everything as a table, right? The formatting subsystem, for example, relies on us being able to modify a type name. So basically, as I said before, when you inspect the type of any object here, right, you get this reference to type literal back. That is a string, right? And so if you try to inspect the name of the type of an object like this, you're always going to get string, right? And I can modify and I can add node properties and do all sorts of weird things to this profile variable or any other variable. It will still be a string, right? So they probably sat down and they said, okay, there are certain circumstances under which we want the underlying object to kind of remain the same. It still needs to be a string or something else, right? But we want to be able to add some metadata that we can then interpret, or that the formatting subsystem can interpret and use to make some decisions about, you know, when to use format table over format list, when to only show a subset of the properties, right? When you do something like, say, get WMI object, Win32 service, you're going to see that we don't actually get all the properties of this WMI class. We only get like 5 or 6 kind of relevant properties. If I want to inspect the services running on my machine, obviously I'm not really interested in, you know, the some internal identifier, or I'm not necessarily interested in what the parent process ID is, right? What I just want to know is, you know, what happened the last time this crashed, what is the name, what is the current process ID if it's running, what is the startup mode, what is the state, and, you know, is everything okay? And so all of this is stored in the formatting subsystem. So here, for example, I can't remember the syntax, but basically the idea here is that any of these objects coming from WMI since they're wrapped in something called a management object, they will all have the same type, regardless of whether it's a Win32 service instance or Win32 user logon. To .NET, it looks like the same, right? To .NET, this is just another WMI object. And so a nice way of kind of overcoming this is this little rubric up here, PS type names. The idea is that you have a writable list type names here that basically represent the object hierarchy. So the class in .NET system.string extends from system.object, and so here you can kind of see this is the type that we're working with, this is the parent type, and so on, until you get down to system.object. And what we can do with this is that you can add, I think you can do insert maybe. And so you can do something like insert my type, name right here. And now, I don't have an example for this right now, but basically what I could do right now is I could update the format, the data in the formatting subsystem and say, whenever you encounter an object of the type my type name, show it all in bright green on the screen, right? Or never do a format table or something like that. And this is basically what's being used. This PS type names facility is being used to govern that different instances of different WMI types can be formatted or treated differently at runtime. So it's pretty cool. All right. So back to what I actually kind of wanted to talk about a little bit, and what I will be talking a lot more about at PSScriptAnalyzer is .NET. You probably all know, and as I've been rambling on about for the last 40 minutes, PowerShell is implemented in .NET, right? Most of it is written in C#. It relies 100% on the .NET runtime, and as I said before, this name, the extended type system, well, what is an extension of? Well, it's an extension of the common type system, the type system that governs .NET. So again, you get all of the niceties and all the behaviors, including some of the weird behaviors that you might not expect. You kind of inherit those from .NET, and then they in PowerShell we kind of extend it a little bit to some of the things I showed you before. And then there are also a couple of things in the extended type system that tries to overcome some of the disadvantages or some of the maybe non-intuitive things that the common type system takes along as well. But let's have a look at this common type system thing. So I think back in 2000 or 2001, C# had been released, and the first iteration of the .NET framework, .NET Framework 1.0, and quickly thereafter followed the .NET 1.1 framework, which became kind of the first major stable application release for .NET. And for C#, right? This was kind of the introduction into the world. Around this time, Microsoft had a pretty ambitious strategy of bringing Visual Basic, which was at the time one of the most popular languages for GUI programming and event-driven programming on Windows, onto this new .NET runtime as well. And they had another project, as you can see from the picture here on the right, called J#, which was basically a re-implementation of Java, although not quite. That's a longer story I'm not going to go into. But as you can see from this kind of diagram, the idea is that they would they submitted a specification. They submitted a specification to ECMA, their standardizations body, saying this is our model for how we're going to build what we call the common language infrastructure. And basically, this was as a competitor to Java, right? One of the big selling points of Java, and still is today, right, is platform cross-compatibility. This idea that I can sit down on my Windows machine or my Macintosh or any supported operating system, really. I can write a library or I can write an application, and I can give you not necessarily the source code, but actually a pre-compiled binary that you can then run in the Java runtime on your machine, right? So all of the code that we start writing, all the libraries that we compile, that you might want to share or you might want to sell, right? All of this becomes compatible across a variety of platforms, right? This means that you have a bigger market, you have a bigger set of people you can collaborate with. And so the Common Language Infrastructure, or .NET as the implementation is called for Microsoft, was kind of the answer to this, right? Can we come up with something similar? One of the core selling points of Java in this regard was that they had something called the JVM, right? The Java Virtual Machine. The idea is that rather than on a single platform take some high-level code, compile that to assembly or bytecode that the machine can understand, you do kind of a pre-compilation step to something that in this example is called the Common Intermediate Language. In Java, it's usually referred to as bytecode. But this idea that you generate it to a machine-readable format that still has all the annotations and all the names that you would use in your high-level programming or in your high-level language. So that means that you can import any other pre-compiled project, and you can actually look at what the names of things are, right? You can refer to a function by name, you can refer to a data type by name, without needing weird header files or simple databases or whatever else you need to kind of resolve the symbols in another library. And so this is super good news to people coming from C or C#, where this is usually a nightmare, at least for large application frameworks. So this common intermediate language, right? This intermediate step of compiling your code to something machine readable but still kind of human interactable, if that's even a word. The common intermediate language, for all of that to work right, they needed a set of rules that all of these compilers would adhere to, so that these data types that we generate in our libraries can interoperate, right? So that we basically end up with the same product. And this is kind of where the common type system comes in. It's part of this idea that you have a common language infrastructure that can be reused by multiple programmers in multiple programming languages, and we can then kind of tie it all together as if it was all written in the same language. So the .NET Common Type System, as I said before, usually type system comes with a number of built-in or natively recognized types. This is also the case in .NET. They directly map onto some types that are found in the semantics of the first version of C#. And basically, we can kind of box data types in .NET into two broad categories. We have value types, and then we have reference types. Then there are some special kinds of types like the array that I don't think I'm qualified to go into. But this is kind of what you get at a minimum. If we divide the types that come out of the box into value types and reference types, you'll see that the value types have something in common. Basically, what we usually call primitive types, these are the numerical types that you're used to, right? 32-bit integers, maybe 64-bit integers or larger integers. You usually have a data type that represents a byte, right? 8 bits. You usually have a data type that represents a Boolean, and this is also the case in .NET. Then you have something like then you have composite types. So this would be an enum. Basically, an enum, as you might be familiar with, is basically lists of names, right? That is associated with an underlying primitive value. So when you define an enum in a language like C#, for example, it can extend one of the primitive types, but it must extend one of the primitive types, right? And the value of a single name of an enum cannot refer to a reference type or like a complex class of any type. Structs being another example of composite type. If you get into a language like C#, for example, you might ask yourself, when should I use structs? When should I use classes? Well, isn't it all just the same? Well, structs has the distinct advantage of, since they're made up of other primitive types, and remember before, this kind of influences memory optimization in the runtime. A struct is made up of primitive types, and all the primitive types we can know the size of up front, right? Again, the 32-bit integer is 32 bits wide. A byte is 8 bits wide. A Boolean, I don't know how they're stored in the .NET runtime, but they should be representable by a single bit, right? And so if you're making up a type, you might have some complex data type that represents something out in the real world or something you're trying to model. Then using a struct has the distinct advantage that, again, we can know the size up front of all of this. And so there's no references being passed back and forth. There's no need for the compiler or the runtime to figure out where in memory this reference to an object that you just gave it is actually residing. So this shaves off some overhead. The other kind of type that we haven't done that, as I said, is a reference type, and this is basically anything else. The system.object class that I introduced before, this idea that we kind of have a root object at the top of the or the bottom of the hierarchy that everything extends from. Any class you implement is a reference type. And this also means, and again, this is usually completely transparent to you when you use a language like C# or F#, VB.NET, PowerShell for that matter. But when you have a variable that points to some complex object, an instance of one of these classes, what the variable represents is not that value. It's not that object itself. The variable represents a reference. So, a memory address, for example, to where in memory this class can be thought. And I'm going to dig a little bit into that in a second. But first, logical structure. This may be a little boring, but this is kind of the logical structure of the type system artifacts we get in .NET. Logically, everything is grouped into namespaces. Again, if you've explored classes or dependency management in PowerShell 5 or 5.1, you've probably had a look at the using namespace directive that's new. Namespaces in .NET can be nested, and a namespace can then contain a class. And again, this is super similar to what a class is in PowerShell. A class in a language like C# or F# can also have a class definition within it. So we can have nested classes. We can have nested primitive data types like enums and structs also defined within a class. And then at the physical layer, right, all of these things are grouped into something called assemblies. And unlike Java, where basically one class has to correspond with where in the file system it is, and you can kind of bake it into a package, so you end up with a jar file that represents one class. I think the engineers at Microsoft probably looked at this and said, this is not very flexible. We need something a little more flexible. So, fair warning here. There's not a one-to-one mapping or a guarantee that there's a one-to-one mapping between a namespace in the .NET type system and then an assembly. And when I say assembly, I'm really talking about DLL files, right, or an exe. An assembly is simply, the file on disk that contains our type definitions and all the code that's attached to it. And so a class, for example, may actually be split over two DLL files. Like to get the full functionality of a class or a data type, you might actually need to import two assemblies. So where's the commonality, right? Sure, this is a type system. It has all the bells and whistles that you would expect from a type system, but where's the commonality, right? What makes this common to one? So remember before I showed the slide, I said the idea is that you should be able to write, code in any language or define your libraries in any language and then reuse them in any other language that targets the .NET platform. And so that's basically what we're going to do now. I think, right. So this is Visual Studio. Don't be intimidated if you haven't seen this before. It probably looks like a bust up version of VS Code if you play around with that. But Visual Studio is kind of the de facto IDE from Microsoft for .NET. You can download a community edition online as of the latest versions. It's free. If you want to play around with C# or larger software projects, you probably want to go with this rather than Visual Studio Code. What I've done here is that I basically created a new project and said I want an executable, right? I want a program I can execute. It should be a command line application. And then rather than writing all, I could write some code in here, right? Like I could say, so console write line. Skill search is pretty cool. And then we can hopefully execute this. And we get this console up saying PSUG. It's pretty cool, right? So again, this is me writing a small application in pure C#. Now what I'm going to do is I've opened another instance of Visual Studio over here, and I've called this project my F# class. And when I created this project, I specified that this should be a library, right? I wanted DLL by the end, some code that I can import somewhere else, and I want the language to be F#. And so F#, if you don't know, it's kind of Microsoft's preferred functional language for .NET. I'm not going to get too even heavy into functional programming, but I think it's pretty cool. So I thought, let's make an example up here. So before, if you've tried in C#, right, or PowerShell, usually a class definition looks something like this, right? Class, then you have a name, and then you have a bunch of methods. You need to declare everything, right? You need to declare the type of some property here. In F#, F# relies on something called type inference, a little bit like PowerShell. This idea that we give a value to any variable, right, and then the runtime will figure out what the type of that value is, and then you can then assign that value to any variable, and the variable will just kind of gladly accept it. So in F#, I've defined a type. Type is the keyword being used there rather than class. I've defined the type F#person. This is to represent a person, right? The constructor takes a name argument, an age argument, and I'm going to feed this to two properties of this object, and then I'm going to, or two members, and then I'm going to create a third member property here called comment, and I'm going to assign a string value to it. So when I do this, say Google solution, what's going to say down here is, I'm sorry, this is probably a little small, but basically what it says down here is, all right, I compiled your code, succeeded, and here's a path to the DLL, the assembly, that you can now use anywhere else. So if this promise is real, right, if this truly is a common language infrastructure, the code I just wrote in F#, I should be able to reuse directly in C# in the other language, right? So let's try this. Basically, we're going to close this again. Make this in my class in here. I'm going to add a reference to the library you saw me compile before. So this is the code we wrote in F#, right? The F# person. I'm going to add this in here. Like in PowerShell, we're going to declare that we are interested in the namespace my F# class. And now down here, I'm going to create an instance of our F# person. And as you can see here, just by declaring this and then adding this reference to the DLL that we wrote in a completely different language, I now have access to this class, this data type, in C#, right? So now I can do something like, I want a new F# person with the name Mathias 28. And what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to print my name. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the comment member that we added before. Remember, I kind of attached a string here. PowerShell rules super hard. Nobody can argue with that. Person, this comment, I'm going to write that to the console as well. And so now we're going to try to compile and run this program again. And whoop, we actually got the value from this type that we define in the other language, right? And so apart from all the me clicking around Visual Studio, which can't really get around that, notice how super easy it was for me to include this data type that I just defined in another language, right? A completely different programming language. I simply just added a reference to a DLL, like I would if I were to import any code that was written in C#, for example, and I could basically reuse it as had I just defined that class in this C# project. So this was kind of my primer into what the .NET Common Type System is, what PowerShell takes from it, and what it kind of builds on top with the extended type system. I hope you enjoyed it or got excited at least a little bit, and I hope I'll see you all in Hanover for the PowerShell conference, Europe 2018. But otherwise, thanks a lot for me.
Thank you, Matthias. That was actually fantastic. I was just sitting here in awe at some of the stuff that I didn't know about, the common type system, PowerShell, how it's all kind of hanging together. So I don't have any questions. I've taken a lot away from this. But we don't have any questions from YouTube. Does anybody on the call have any questions for Matthias? Yep.
Well, thank you much. Yeah. Otherwise, if yeah, as you said, like there's probably a bunch of new stuff here. If you've never kind of dug under the hood, right? If you've never tried to poke at some of this stuff. If you have any questions, if you have any feedback, and again, I will be diving a little more into both topics at PSConf.eu. So yeah, if you have any questions, have any input, any feedback, or if I lost you halfway through, please let me know. And yeah, always happy to take questions. I don't know if you mentioned earlier, Paul, but if you don't know, I'm on Twitter, IIS370, and my DMs are open, so feel free to ask questions. And if you think you have a stupid question, feel free to DM it to me. I won't publish it.
Yeah, I actually at the very beginning I put your Twitter handle on the agenda. So yeah, Chris has a question. Chris, you're on the call. Why don't you just ask it?
Yeah. You think this would improve? So what are we trying to compare here? Like, what would improve performance?
Hopefully, for a second. Chris, are you able to speak? No, Chris is not going to tell us.
Right. Okay. I'm not sure I understood the question correctly. I'm just going to quickly say something about performance and in relation to this whole PS objects that wrap everything. I often hear people say, or at least earlier, you should write your commandlets in C#, right? You should find a compile language. If you're serious about implementing commandlets and implementing functions, you should do it in C# for performance reasons, right? The reason for this is that anything, if I go back to Visual Studio right now and I start writing some code in C#, it is obviously not going to be hindered by all of this PS object wrapping, right? PowerShell has nothing to do in the compiler, and the point at which this PS object is going to wrap whatever output I have from my commandlet, I'm done doing all my computations, right? So I can do a bunch of things without kind of PowerShell interfering with me. So again, if you're doing high-performance commandlets, or you're doing commandlets that are relying on large sets of input, or you have many kind of internal transactions in what you're trying to do, definitely break out Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, implement your commandlets in C#, in F#, in VB.NET. As a rule of thumb, PowerShell is fine. Most of the stuff that you probably need to set down and write functions for is not going to be either that computationally heavy or have a lot of overhead from a lot of transactions. Again, obviously your mileage may vary, but I find that this is probably not the number one reason to switch lanes or switch strategies when you're implementing something. Is that I hope that made a bit more sense.
Yeah, thanks for that, Matthias. And we've got just a couple of comments that were on the call. Everybody seemed to really enjoy that. And Ewan's going to have to watch it back again to fully grasp it all. I think I will as well. But that was a fantastic talk. I really, really appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me on, Paul. I'll likely be back after PSScriptAnalyzer if you'll have me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, guys, what we're going to do is we're going to take maybe well, not going to take maybe, we're going to take a 5-minute break. And then we're going to have Chris come on and talk about PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer. So we'll be back in 5.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Well, that's our 5 minutes up now, guys. So what we're going to do is we're going to hand over to Chris. Chris, if you're ready to take over, I can hand you over control and you can tell us all about PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer. I've handed you over control now, Chris. Let me know if there's any problems. Is your audio working okay, Chris? You may just not have said anything as yet, but I can't actually hear you.
Thank you. So,
There
shall
we
we
go.
start if everyone is ready?
Yeah, you
Thank you.
got control is yours. Off you go.
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Let me know if I'm talking too loud or if I should talk louder or slow down or whatever. I'm watching the YouTube comments a bit on the side as well. Okay, let's get started with the PSScriptAnalyzer. Can you see the slides?
Yes, I can see them.
Okay, great. Let's get started. So, my name is Chris. I've studied physics and I'm now in software for about 2 years at a company called Willis Towers Watson. I work in the London area and I'm mainly a .NET developer, but I'm a bit more interested in the DevOps side of things. That includes PowerShell, Azure, Docker, VSTS, which is kind of interesting because most people in the PowerShell community are a bit more on the ops side, whereas I'm rather on the dev side. I'm the author of 2 PowerShell modules called Posh.NET and Posh VSTS CLI. They're basically tab completion helpers. So in the command line, when you're using the .NET CLI, you could just type .NET B and then it would auto-complete you. So it's just some little helpers that I wrote. I'm now, since I think the start of this year, a maintainer of PSScriptAnalyzer, and I'm heavily contributing to the PowerShell core repo as well for more than half a year now. Some of it is of personal interest, some of it is work related. You can find me on GitHub using the Bermeister handle, where you usually see me with that profile picture in there. I've got a blog as well, but most of the stuff that I write there is for myself. When I have to keep looking up stuff too often, I write it down. But I also write down bits and bobs as well that I find interesting. So much about me. Let's get started. So I was thinking of having a small icebreaker showing you cool things that you can do with PowerShell. And on a weekend, I did a small project called C-Matrix, which is a fork where someone else did already a lot of work, and I basically enhanced the project. And I will just show you what it does. It's basically the matrix in PowerShell, which I think is kind of cool. All right, now that we're warmed up, let's talk a bit about PSScriptAnalyzer. PSScriptAnalyzer is open source, so you can contribute to it as well, enhance it. You can package it yourself, distribute it if you want to use it internally in your software. It's owned by Microsoft, but they're really open to contributions. I started contributing a few months ago, and they're really open to suggestions how to improve it. And I really like the new way how Microsoft does open source, much better than other people do open source, I have to personally admit. So what is the tool? Most people know the tool for being a static code analyzer, and that's also how I learned PSScriptAnalyzer first, where it basically tells you you shouldn't do this or that, and stuff like that. But also it's a style linter and formatter. This functionality was introduced about a year ago, and it's integrated into VS Code. And many people don't know some of the features, so we'll show some of them. although it's a very low-level module, due to the integration, it can have quite a bit of an impact. So let me show you a bit as an overview. Some of you might know the PowerShell repo here, which is a collection of PowerShell repos from the PowerShell system. Has got 6 start repos. One of them is PSScriptAnalyzer. There is VS Code PowerShell, which is the PowerShell extension of VS Code. And what this extension basically does, it wraps another repository called PowerShell Editor Services. And the PowerShell Editor Services repo internally wraps PSScriptAnalyzer. So that's how I will show in a couple of minutes how PSScriptAnalyzer is integrated into VS Code. Check the messages. That's great. So it offers corrections as well when you get warnings through it, and those I will show in the integration of VS Code. Under current development is advice on PS Core compatibility, because some of the commandlets were removed or there were breaking changes. There's some of it is implemented, but that's also why Microsoft came back and wants to put a bit more effort into this tool, polish it a bit more to make it easier for people to write PowerShell scripts that would work in Windows PowerShell and PowerShell Core, which is known under PowerShell 6 as well. It's built using .NET Standard or for Windows PowerShell Classic full.NET 4.5.1, which means it's cross-platform. And if you think about .NET Standard, it would in theory allow the Xamarin runtime as well. So the Mono, for example, you could in theory run it on a mobile device. In practice, it wouldn't work because it kind of has a dependency on the parser, which is the PowerShell parser itself. So in practice, although it's .NET Standard, it's a bit more like .NET Core at the end. So what does PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer not do? It doesn't help you write correct syntax. The PowerShell Editor Services is the right module for that. It doesn't warn you on any mistakes. There's a few rules being implemented, but there's way more stuff to do. It won't tell you for anything, so it's kind of more like there's some rules that are quite useful and you can spot mistakes, but you shouldn't take it as like the golden code analysis tool. If it passes all rules, then your script is fine. We're way far ahead from being there. So it can help you sometimes a bit with learning PowerShell, but it doesn't replace a good book or like the PowerShell best practices repo, which tells you about not just gotchas as well, how to write good code. So it's really more about calling out certain bad practices that are known that could lead to bad behavior. Unfortunately, the way it works internally, sometimes warnings do not get triggered, so you can't always rely on them. And the other way around, annoyingly for some rules, you get false positives as well. But that's kind of similar for any code analysis tool, especially when I compare it to ReSharper, that you as a human have to make a decision, is the warning true or not, and have to make a judgment on it. So there's a lot of human intelligence still being involved. Why should you use ScriptAnalyzer? When you see the rules that ScriptAnalyzer gives you or the warnings when you run tool, it means you'll learn about some best practices for gotchas. So it's kind of learning on the go as well. You can find bugs and prevent expensive debugging time. That's why I wanted to use it first. When I first heard of this tool, I was trying to look into a tool that's similar to C#, where you get code analysis, and that's exactly what the tool does. It's free, so yeah, why not use it? So there's no downside to it. It has code style rules as well, so if you want to have a consistent style in your team or organization, you can enforce those rules as well using PSScriptAnalyzer. And it can help you review code changes, but you shouldn't rely on it, as I said. So been talking now quite a bit about it. Let me get started with the demo in VS Code. GSU, and I will come back to that. Let's go into VS Code. So I've got here a very simple script, and you can see a squiggle here. GCI is an alias for get child item, and one of the rules of PSScriptAnalyzer is you shouldn't use aliases because people who learn about PowerShell and are in their very first days, they don't know about those aliases. And also looking forward to the future in PowerShell 6.1 or 6.2, some of them might get removed. And we already know of some of them that got removed in 6.0, for example, the curl alias, because curl is available as a native binary on Linux. So we get a squiggle here, which is a warning. And if we click on it, we see this bulb here, which offers us suggestions. Replace it with get child item, job done very nicely. So this is how VS Code, together with the PowerShell editor services, integrates PSScriptAnalyzer nicely into the editor. In my VS Code, I use a special version of PSScriptAnalyzer, which is actually the latest version that has not yet been released. So I'll show you a new rule that you will see in the next release. And when you use VS Code, you might have already realized you see few warnings than you see when you run the tool. That is because there's settings in VS Code. So if I press Ctrl-Shift-P, I can actually select the rules that VS Code should warn me against. And the rule that I'm looking for is the possible incorrect usage of assignment operator. So let's take this, confirm. And now, as the squiggle is there, it's telling me, did you really mean to use the assignment operator? Because I quite often switch between C#.NET and PowerShell. It happens that I forget basic syntax or I'm just used it from the other language. So it can easily happen that you type in equals, but actually what you mean is that. So this is a new rule that will come up in the next version. I had bad experiences to do that in the past because it's not very obvious when you look at the code what is wrong with it, and it will take you a bit of time to debug it and find that small gotcha, which is just a human mistake at the end. There's also another rule being implemented that will show up in the next version, which is the PS avoid assignment to automatic variables, which we see here now. We see here it's a red squiggly. So PSScriptAnalyzer gives you 3 types of warnings or warning levels. So there's information, warning, and error. And here it was chosen to be error because $error is an automatic variable that's built into PowerShell. And if you override it, bad things can happen for automatic variables, and for $error, in practice, you will actually get an error. So there's no point having that in a script because it will just blow up at runtime. Let me just check. Then another warning that I need to enable is the PS possibly incorrect comparison with null, which I think everyone should have turned on, because in PowerShell you should always have $null on the left-hand side. So it's a bit like in the old days of C or C++, but the reasons are different. So I will give you, there's multiple examples in there, and basically it all boils down to what comparison operators do in terms of their expected behavior. And it's not very intuitive if you think of as a human, what does equal or not equal mean? There's a couple of gotchas. But the main outcome is if you use $null on the left-hand side, you don't have to read the docs because you know you're safe. So let me just show you this example where I have an array here, and you test, is the array null, then print true, otherwise print false. So let's see what happens here. It's false. So when you say, let's say not equal, then surely it must print true. because not equal is a negation of equal, false. So what is happening here is actually the expression inside the if statement doesn't return any object at all. So that's why it goes then into the else clause. There's multiple cases that one can construct, but as I said, the main outcome is just put $null on the left-hand side and you will be fine. Be careful with corrections, because if you have existing code that is working fine and you start to put $null on the left-hand side now, it could be that some of your code was actually relying on this and going into the wrong branches. It seems to be good to correct it, but be aware that actually you might be relying on this bug here in your code if you correct the code. I think that I will show a bit later. We'll come back to show us and some of the internals of PSScriptAnalyzer a bit later. So let's go back to the presentation. So this was the VS Code integration. Now I want to show the commandlet usage, because we have seen kind of what PSScriptAnalyzer gives you at the end, but the commandlet is how it started first and how you should normally use it, for example, in CI. So just to demonstrate its cross-platform, I am going to switch over to my Ubuntu VM. I'm going to open a terminal, which is a Linux shell. So pwsh gives me into PowerShell core. And one of the commandlets is called invoke ScriptAnalyzer, and you can also give it a script definition. So let's try GCI. And yeah, it works great. So let's see what we get here. So we get the rule name, ps avoid commandlet aliases, the severity, which is warning. It also tells us where it is. If we used the -path parameter set, it would tell us exactly where in the script it is. The object that it returns us, let's see if we can get it back. So warning. Select star. It gives us also a suggested corrections object. And if we go and look at this object, this is actually the suggestion that VS Code uses how to replace it with the correct commandlet, which is get child item in this case here. So the idea was to go back to the repository to show you all the other commandlets that are available for PSScriptAnalyzer. The first one is get ScriptAnalyzer rule, which is going to give you all rules. So if we execute that, that's going to give us a bunch of rules. And I think that's about maybe 54, so quite a lot of them. You can use this if you want to invoke ScriptAnalyzer later on and then specify exclude rule or include rule. It also has custom rule sets that you can use to extend PSScriptAnalyzer. So the custom rules, most people write in PowerShell, not in C#. You can write them in C# as well, but it's a bit awkward integrating them at the moment. So there's a bit more work to be done on this parameter. And people like Thomas Reiner, for example, they would like to have PowerShell defined rules integrated into the core set of PSScriptAnalyzer, which is a thing that I want to look into next month, because it would be good to get more rules into PSScriptAnalyzer to make it more useful. So basically the difference between those two parameter sets is basically one is for a path and one is for a script definition. So the script definition I as a developer use quite often just to smoke test PSScriptAnalyzer. But I think also VS Code uses it because VS Code uses the string in memory. But most users, they would use the -path option, where you can have, it's a bit similar to Pester, where you can have a recurse option here to recurse all directories, where just from the root, where you have your PowerShell scripts, you would traverse down the subfolders. There's suppressed only, so we'll talk about rule suppression a bit later. There's a -fix switch that you can actually at the moment not use, so this is going to come up. So let me go up a bit. What you see here on the repository of PSScriptAnalyzer is the development branch. So this is where we constantly merge stuff into, but this is not the branch that actually got released. The release branch is master. So that's why you see here the -fix switch, but when you actually use it at the moment, you don't have the -fix switch, so we will have to wait for the next version that should hopefully come out in the next 1, 2, or 3 weeks. A new option as well is enable exit that will be available in the next version. So the idea behind this was some people, and I myself as well, use it in CI, but then you have to wrap it up in for each rule, for each script, which is a bit tedious, and this was kind of a lazy, quick way to, similar to Pester, you return an exit code that you can just invoke ScriptAnalyzer, and if there's any warnings, return a non-zero error code to fail CI, so that you can easily integrate it into CI in one line. This was a feature request that I did recently as well, a report summary, where similar to Pester, which tells you how many tests passed and how many tests failed, it will print you the number of warnings, and then depending if you have warning, there will be a slightly different color. But because we write to the host, I wasn't sure if we wanted to enable it by default, so at the moment it's a switch. Maybe in the future we change it to -no report summary to print it by default and have the switch only to not make it print. So we were rather cautious about always writing to the host because we weren't sure yet how other people use it. So we also want to get a bit of feedback on this new switch before we include it by default. There's a settings object where you can include all sorts of stuff. You can include style rules. So there's different brace styles like Allman or Strustrup, and PSScriptAnalyzer ships with 3 distinct rules, 3 style rules that are defined here, so you could use those in settings. You can also specify a special PSD1 file that basically describes which rules you want to have, and for some special rules you can configure white lists or black lists. So there's settings is a bit ambiguous for what it's being used for. Maybe it should be split into multiple parameters. But the most common use case is that you would supply the path to a settings file of which rules it should use at the end. If you have a special PSD1 file called, I think, PSScriptAnalyzer rules at PSD1, and you run the tool, then it picks it up from the current location by default, and you don't have to specify -settings. But this is all documented here in the main manual as well. I'm not sure about safe DSC dependency because I haven't played around with DSC too much, so we'll leave you to explore this option here. The invoke formatter is basically this linter functionality to take in a script and apply the right brace style or insert or remove white space or tabs, all that sort of stuff that VS Code uses as well. When in VS Code you can press Control, I think it's a KF to auto format your code. Let's see if we can do a quick demo. Say if I had my braces like that, Control A, Control F, and it rearranges it to the current style that I have defined. In VS Code, there's actually, I think, 3 levels. There's workspace settings, and there's user settings, and additionally, you can specify also the PSScriptAnalyzer settings file. You could store those settings in your repository if you have a .vs code folder. So if you open VS Code in this directory, it will use the settings that you define here. Like here, for example, the code formatting is specified as Allman, and all those VS Code settings you can actually save. and specify other PowerShell options as well, which shell you would launch as part of VS Code. So I think I showed you the main commandlets and how to use them. But what if you have warnings and you think, oh, I'm not interested in implementing that because X, Y, Z, or it's a false positive, then you also want to suppress those warnings so that you don't always see them. So PSScriptAnalyzer offers ways of suppressing warnings, which is here in the suppressing rules section. So the way it finds them is by looking for param or function blocks. So that's why you would have it above the param. And it uses the .NET suppressed message attribute. So you can literally go there, look at the documentation of it. And the way this .NET object works is that unfortunately the second string always have to be an empty string. So that's just the way how this .NET method works. But at least some people might recognize it from the C# code analysis. It's the exact same attribute being used. You can have some scoping, you can have function or module scoping, but unfortunately at the moment it doesn't allow you to suppress just for one line. Sometimes you can specify whitelists for some rules, but there's more work to be done. What I want to see in the future personally is to have a similar functionality like resharper, where we say #disable warning and then #enable warning, and for everything in between it disables the warning so that you can basically disable the warning for a block or just for one line, because basically it bloats your code quite a bit as well, so there's a bit more work to be done. And a common gotcha is you can also have a PowerShell file that you can call directly into, and then you can do whatever, write some function code here. And how would you suppress it? And the gotcha is you have to know how it works under the hood. You would have to introduce a param block, just that it can actually realize that, and then you could do that, copy pasted it above, and then if you just call a PowerScript like that, then you can suppress it like this as well, but then again it's for the whole file, so it's not very nice. So we want to improve that in the future going forward. I've included here a link to how to integrate it into CI. This is in one of my small repositories, which I use for my personal profile here, so feel free to have a look at it. The idea is first we get each rule of the ScriptAnalyzer rules, which we get by calling getScriptAnalyzer rules. I'm just going to get all of them, and then for each of them we are basically getting the analysis, which is get from calling invoke ScriptAnalyzer on each file. So we have 2 for each loops, and then I'm basically just asserting that the count should be 0. You could definitely improve it. One of the downsides of this approach is that you end up with 600 or 1000 unit tests. So they're kind of bloating your test report a bit, but at least if you have a failure, you know exactly which file and which rule was violated. So this is kind of the most common approach here, but people do variations on this pattern here for integrating it into CI. I would like to give now a bit of an overview on the rules. Hope it's not going to be too boring, but when you start using ScriptAnalyzer, it's important to understand some of the rules, and we do have rule documentation on it, so it's again directly on the GitHub repo where we have markdown files for each rule. Each of those markdown files also corresponds to the set of rules in the rules folder, which is the C# implementation. So it's sometimes always good to double check the implementation if you have questions, because frankly speaking, we should improve the documentation much more. There's much more to be done. Sometimes it's missing examples or more detailed explanations. So it would be great if people could maybe help a bit out as well with contributing documentation. We actually had just today a pull request from someone externally improving, I think, was it typos and other bits and bobs, adding more examples. So that's really great to see the community contributing this way. So I would like to see more of it. So I'm going through the rules. I'm going to talk about some of them a bit more, some of them a bit less. The rules, what we want to split in the future as well. At the moment, all rules are just in one folder, but actually it should be separated into style rules and code analysis rules. So the first rule here is a line assignment statement, so which is a style rule. So that is not going to be too interesting. Let's look at an actual code analysis rule. So this is the one that I briefly talked about before, and this will show up in the next release. It's not currently available. It's the idea to warn against assignment to automatic variables. At the moment, it's warning against only read-only variables, because we know for sure it will give you an error at runtime. There's certain automatic variables that you actually want to assign to by design. For example, the verbose preference. So we're in the process of figuring out which automatic variables are okay to assign to at the moment. So I've only done the ones where we know for sure we don't want anyone using that in a script because it will blow up. And so commonly you've got an example here, how you should not do stuff, where you define the parameter function as error, which happens to be built in. A very common and similar mistake is also to use $input, which is an automatic variable as well. It's not read-only, so we will probably add this variable as well to the list of verboten variables. And the correct way is just to use a variable name that is not an automatic variable. If you want to see which variables are given by PowerShell and automatic in a fresh PowerShell session, you would just type get variable. In my case, because of a profile, you see a bit more, but PID is from PowerShell home. I think if I can get maybe more of a vanilla PowerShell, the best thing is actually to use PowerShell core, but I don't have so much of my profile in there. Get variable, so PWD, the profile variable. Those are new ones introduced in PowerShell core. So is core CLR, is Linux, is Windows, and so on. False is also, as you know, $false. The question mark operator and all that stuff that is built in and shouldn't be assigned to unless you know what you're doing.
Matches is one that's caught me out before.
Matches, let's see if it's a good one. So it would be great if people add those things as well to the issues to give us a bit of an idea. I'm talking at the moment quite often with Jessen, who is one of the main PowerShell developers, and he's given me really good feedback on which variables you really want to assign to and which not, but it would be great to get input from the community as well. So yeah, thanks for that, Paul. Let's go through one of the next ones. Avoid default for mandatory parameter. So if you declare a parameter as mandatory, then it doesn't make sense to specify default value because PowerShell by default will prompt you anyway for it. So there's actually no way of using a default value for a mandatory parameter. So that's why the rule is there. It's really as simple as that. Some of the rules, they are quite simple. And at the end, it means just we have to slowly add up more rules. Only the having a real big amount of rules will make it more and more useful, and we're kind of slowly getting there. So some of the rules you might think, is it worth warning about it? Because it might sound stupid at first. Why would you do that? Sometimes it can happen. Just catching one or two issues is, I think, good. And at the end, it will just accumulate the more rules we have. Avoid default value switch parameter. This is very similar as well, except that in this case, it would actually work to specify a default here, but usually the the way how people expect PowerShell to work is switch is something that is off by default and you only turn it on. The whole point about having switches in PowerShell was that people don't have Boolean variables, they have true or false. And then you would be kind of going back to using Booleans. So that's why this rule is in place. I have to say, because I only recently joined PSScriptAnalyzer, most of the rules I haven't written. So it's a bit about a disclaimer that I've only read these rules myself, but I've actually not written them. So you can go on each of those rules, look at history, and history will either go back to Capel or one of the other Microsoft guys that you might need to ask if you need to find out some details. But usually by looking at the C# implementation, you can get more details about the reasoning, or sometimes people ask questions and issues, which I think is great because then we know why people don't understand the rules, or sometimes I had to figure out myself why is this rule there, and then we can improve the documentation going forward. There's a couple of rules about global stuff, so global aliases, functions, and variables. And the gist is basically, it's a basic programming paradigm. Everything being global is a bit of a code smell or is bad. Sometimes you have to use it, like for example in my tab completion modules, I have to use global functions because it has to be available globally. But the idea is still to warn on it, to make you scratch your head. Do we really need to make it global or not? And then you can make a judgment on it and suppress the rule and give a comment on why it needs to be global. Avoid invoking empty members. The idea behind this rule is that if something is not constant, then you could be invoking something that is empty. It's kind of similar to C# where you get this nasty null reference exception. In this case, it's more about it potentially leading to bugs if you construct stuff yourself. Personally, I'm not sure how useful this rule is in there, but usually I think the way to go is implement a couple of rules, get feedback, and then if it turns out to be a rubbish rule, we can deprecate it. There's already a couple of rules being deprecated in PSScriptAnalyzer. So some of the stuff, we just have to try out how it goes. Avoid null or empty help message attribute. This is a warning, but I think it should be rather informational. It's kind of saying you probably copy-pasted a function definition and they didn't provide a message. Why would you specify the parameter? Just remove the parameter completely, or please specify a help message. So that is the simple idea behind these rules. Avoid should continue without force. That's a bit more of a style warning as well when you use support should process, and there's also should continue in there. And you might want to implement a for switch. So this is more about having a consistent experience as a PowerShell user. The idea behind PowerShell was to have this consistent experience, like approved verbs, get this, new this, so that you, if you get a new module, you want to instantly be able to use the module in the command lines without having to learn how to use them. And it is consistency here as well. Avoid trailing whitespace. This is more of a style warning. In VS Code, you can actually specify by default at the point when you save that you don't have trailing whitespace. Where this can catch you out, this is maybe more of a PowerShell quirk, is there's the backtick in PowerShell, and if you happen to have a space character after the backtick, then the behavior of PowerShell might change subtly, and then you can have bugs or weird behavior. So it's just something that was observed in PowerShell if you have a white space after the backtick, and the rule is just please avoid trailing white space, especially with backticks. There's usually not really a need for it. And having it integrated into the editor, it autocorrects it for you, so then it shouldn't be much of an issue. There's avoid trap statement. This goes back to the very old days of PowerShell, where trap was a bit like a catch block, but it wasn't a proper catch block, and the idea is you should rather use the catch block now. PowerShell version 1 and 2 are already deprecated, and then from version 3 going onwards, there's no real need to use trap anymore. So this is why this rule is not there. Speaking about PowerShell versions, PSScriptAnalyzer is supported from PowerShell version 3+, so there's no restriction on the PowerShell version that you use. Avoid uninitialized variable. This is kind of what you would think as intuitive when you use a variable and it's not being initialized, then you don't know where it's coming from. Because of the way how scoping works in PowerShell, a child scope by default inherits the parent scope, which is not very intuitive if you think of it from a C# programmer's perspective, but that's how PowerShell works. And it can lead to weird bugs where if you don't pass in all the dependencies of a function, it can happen a function just happens because you do something on a higher level. So it leads to very brittle code. So my personal suggestion is really try to pass in everything into a function that you depend on inside the function, so it's very clear how the flow of variable goes. Because most of the time, an uninitialized variable is just given from a higher scope. So it should be either initialized or being passed into the function. Avoid using command aliases. We touched on this. It's not very beginner friendly. It's very useful to use it in the shell to do quick typing and all of that sort of stuff. Going forward, some of the aliases were removed in PowerShell version 6, and there's going to be a big refactoring in the future as well about aliases. Avoid using computer name hard-coded. The idea is just scripts are being used for automation, and then they're checked into source control, and then they run continuously. And you don't want your script to depend on your infrastructure normally. So that's why you should pass in everything as a parameter, make your functions generic, and don't have any hard-coded stuff in there. And if I remember correctly, this rule gets triggered only if you name the parameter of a function computer name, and when you call it and its computer name, it detects that, and if it sees it's a hard-coded string, then it's saying, "Oi, this should probably be a variable, and not something being hard-coded." Avoid using convert to string. This rule is very questionable. It's marked as error, but in practice, unfortunately, CI systems like VSTS don't support secure strings for what they call secure variables. So the secrets in VSTS are being passed in as plain text, and when you call APIs that require a secure string, you have to use the as plain text switch for the convert to secure string commandlet. So there's no way of getting around it. It's maybe nice to have the warning, but in practice, most of the time when you use it, you've got a reason why you have to use as plain text. So the warning is more about there saying, "Are you sure you really want to do that?" So it's a bit more of a style warning, I think, and avoid using deprecated manifest fields. This rule was actually quite useful to me when I joined a new team this year. I just ran ScriptAnalyzer on their code base, and they had a manifest in there that was using a deprecated field. You have to do some analysis on the PowerShell version being used in terms of when this field was being deprecated and how the behavior changed. But most of the time, you can just replace the old one with root module, which should be the new way of doing stuff. So this way, it's a nice way of documenting certain deprecations. Avoid using empty catch block. A similar rule exists in C# as well, where if there's nothing in the catch block, then why are you catching it, especially if you catch a specific exception in here. You should think about maybe using error action instead. It's again just giving you a warning to maybe have a think about it if you really need to do it this way. Sometimes reality is just you need to have empty catch blocks because whatever you call does something naughty and gives you errors that you have to ignore. Let's move a bit quicker through some of the other rules. Avoid using file path. This is about if you have UNC paths in there, so very similar to the computer name commandlet. You shouldn't have too much hard-coded stuff, and in this case, it's about file paths. Invoke expression is very important for security because it allows you to really, as the commandlet says, invoke any expression. And if you construct the expression, then you're kind of vulnerable depending on who calls into your commandlet, that someone could kind of try hack your system this way. So you should be careful when using it. There are use cases for it, but most of the time you're working around something that you should be able to solve. Quite often it's just a case of using the ampersand operator to invoke a script block. Sometimes people just don't know about it. They read somewhere on a blog or on Stack Overflow and copy paste stuff. So this rule is about warning of using this commandlet. Because if you look at most of the attacks in PowerShell, they use invoke expression because you can do literally anything with invoke expression. So that's why this is there. Avoid using plain text for password. This is a style warning as well. I think based on if a parameter is called password, it recommends you using your secure string. Avoid using positional parameters is that you shouldn't call get foo, $A, $B, $C. You should say minus parameter name A and the object, so that you know exactly which parameters that you're calling, so that you don't rely on the position. Future versions of a commandlet could change that, and then suddenly your script breaks. So that's why this rule is in there. But sometimes if there's just one or two parameters, then it's not really worth the hassle like test path. So this rule only triggers if you have more than 3 parameters being supplied. Avoid using username and password. This is very similar to plain text, where if you use both of them together, you should think about if you need to pass in those credentials. Avoid using WMI. Commandlet is there because the new way to go is SIM commandlets. WMI is not deprecated, but SIM is the better way to go. Write host shouldn't be used because most of the time you either want to use write verbose or write output. The reason why write host is kind of bad and some people say it's killing puppies is because you can't pipe it away, so you can always see it on the screen. Write verbose writes to the verbose stream that you can pipe away, and write output is for returning an object. Because quite often.
Sorry, I'm just a quick side question. Has the behavior for write host changed since PowerShell 4 or 5? Because it used to be like one of the other things was that if you had your write host output in there, you would then, and you were returning stuff, it would then mess up your return. But has that changed now? Do you know?
I'm not aware that it messed up the return. So are you saying it actually returned an object?
Okay.
Write host now writes to information stream as well as the screen.
Yeah, I was thinking something had gone on with write information and write host. And...
Yeah, that was new in PowerShell 5.
Is that Chris?
Okay.
Yes.
That's great.
Oh, okay. Sorry, thank you.
Great. I'm just looking at the time in terms of if I should proceed a bit further. Do you want me to go through some of the rules more in detail, or do you want me to proceed in terms of the time?
Proceed in terms of the time. I think because if you can show people where they can find the rules, there's a URL at the top. They can go through all the rules that they want to see. I mean, most of the names of the rules are sort of self, they document themselves, but yeah, they can go in there and get more information from the markdown files.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think we've covered some of them, and people can read them, and I think most of them make sense once you read them. We're open to PRs, as I said, for improving them. But just as I look at the time, I didn't expect it to take that much time. because I still have got a couple of more stuff to talk about that is interesting. So there's some known issues in PSScriptAnalyzer. One of the big culprits is PS use declared variables more than assignment, which gives you a lot of false positives, unfortunately. That's because it does it only on a per script block basis. It doesn't use a single static analysis. It's not aware of the scope if you .source or invoke a script, so the scope can be different. I've made some improvements to it. It should be much, much better in the next version, but there's much, much more to be done for this rule to really be intelligent. So for the moment being, unfortunately, yes, there's a lot of false positives. What I use personally as well, instead of suppressing them, you can use script scope. And then by knowing the implementation, you can kind of bypass it and then not get the warning. Another big issue is also the parsing. So PSScriptAnalyzer has got a self-contained version of the PowerShell parser, and by design a parser is static and doesn't load DLLs. But there's certain cases, especially when classes were introduced in PowerShell. So when we go to this example here, like the Azure M module, and you're using statements, then, and if you use a type in there, then it will just throw PSScriptAnalyzer relies on a parser, and it can't analyze a script if it can't parse the script. So using some of the advanced syntax in PowerShell 5 with using statements and imported types, we can't analyze at the moment. And it's not clear what we should do about it. Maybe just walk around and replacing the unknown types, or trying to make it parse, but then we would be loading DLLs in order to get that information. So the future on that is not really clear, but it's a known issue at the moment. Docs, as I said, PRs are welcome. And I've briefly mentioned single statement analysis, which there's some implementation in there, but it needs a lot of work to work properly. I've tried to test it on a new rule to warn on plus equals for arrays, because it can be bad for performance, because every time you do plus equal, it recreates you a whole array. And I found it kind of works, but then in some cases it doesn't work. So once we've implemented single state analysis, PSScriptAnalyzer should become much, much more intelligent. If you have questions, use GitHub or Slack. There's a PowerShell Slack channel that most people know about. And there's now a new ScriptAnalyzer channel as well. Some of the work that I've done so far on it is the -fix switch. That's actually how I got into ScriptAnalyzer, because I wanted to fix a bunch of modules all in one go. And instead of having using VS Code, right-click, replace, or writing some regular expression, I'm actually using what VS Code is using under the hood as well to fix the warnings. And then you can run it against the path or files and fix them. The small gotcha is it can't preserve the encoding in all cases, so it does the correct fixes if a fix is available. But before you check it in the source control, you might want to check the encoding and make sure it still is the same encoding if your scripts are code sensitive. But if you just work on Windows, encoding shouldn't be much of an issue. It's more of an issue if you go cross-platform. The enable exit I've briefly mentioned is for CI usage to return the exit code. The report summary is similar to Pester, giving you a report summary. I've refactored the build to previously it was using .NET Core preview, I think 6, which was from the old project, the Jessen days, and now it's using .NET Core 2.0 SDK, which means now you can just check it out, open the Visual Studio solution, build right out of the box, so much better development experience right now. 2 new rules that I mentioned before. One where we currently have a PR for is to warn when you, for example, have service, and if you type service in PowerShell, actually it will go look for a commandlet because there's no commandlet called service on Windows, and it will try to append a get and see if you can find it, and then it will call get service, which is nice on the command line, but you don't want to use it in scripts, so that's why you want to add it to the alias as rule set. Lots of bugs and documentation fixes I've done, and work that is being done right now is PowerShell core build on Windows and Linux. The one for Windows has just been merged today. Linux is about to proceed, I think, next week. I've got it already working. I just need to fix some tests that don't work on Linux. So how does PSScriptAnalyzer work under the hood? So it uses the AST, which is the abstract syntax tree, which is something internal to PowerShell. And in order to show you that, and that's actually what I use for development as well, is a command called shows from this module show PSS, which is from Jessen, who is one of the PowerShell developers. I think I've got a snippet somewhere there. Show as. If I execute that there, it will give you a nice visual representation of how the command that looks actually under the hood to the PowerShell engine and how PSScriptAnalyzer is analyzing it. So on the right hand side you see your script, that's your PowerShell code, and on the left hand side you see all the abstract syntax trees that it consists of, and you can click on each of them and to see what it is. We've got the if statement, we've got pipeline, command, expression as, all those things, and you see also the properties on there. And basically PSScriptAnalyzer, most rules go ahead and say, give me all if statement assignments or this kind of abstract syntax tree, and then go a bit deeper, combine it together. Is this on the right and left hand side? Once you get the strongly typed version of the est, you can, for example, see the specific properties, especially for assignments. Is it like, or you can see the left and right hand side. I don't have an assignment here, but basically you get more details once you parse it to the appropriate est, and then you can figure out what the script is actually doing. So that is the whole idea. And that's also why PSScriptAnalyzer has this dependency in the PowerShell parser. It's only using the abstract syntax tree, not more and not less. And that's how you can write custom rules as well. So some people like Christian did a presentation last week ago in London, which I've linked here, where he's got loads of examples here on certain rules. Like for example, stop using right host. So you pass in a command list, and there's also methods on those abstract syntax trees, like get command name, and it's just checking does it contain right host, and then it's giving back a diagnostic record, which is a PSScriptAnalyzer internal object, and that's how simple it is to write a custom rule. And the way how you would invoke it is to have the example here. So we'd use invoke ScriptAnalyzer minus custom rule path. And there's this gotcha at the moment that the custom rule path has to be a string that is already being resolved. In the next version, you could specify a variable that is going to be resolved once you pass it to the ScriptAnalyzer, but at the moment it has to be a string that is already resolved. In this case here, I would just reference to his PSM1 file. It would run this rule and warn me if I use right host. Do I have the snippet there? I thought somewhere I had the snippet there. But this is how you can write custom code. If you look at some of the C# rules, I find C# a bit more easier to write. Maybe just because of Visual Studio, that it's a bit more straightforward to get access to certain properties and methods, but also ScriptAnalyzer itself has lots of helper methods that simplify you having to deal with the abstract syntax trees that you don't have available if you write it in vanilla PowerShell. So I want to make it easier to write custom codes in C# instead of writing it in vanilla PowerShell. But I want to refer to those examples which are a bit more extensive if you want to write custom rules yourself. And I just learned yesterday there's also people are playing with the est as well. There's other repos as well to help you understand the est a bit better and get certain stuff done here. So that's why I've linked in this repository as well to help you learn more about the abstract syntax trees and get the job done inside your custom rule. then the idea was to do a very quick demo because now it's so easy to do to build and debug PSScriptAnalyzer from scratch. So it's really as simple. You go here. This is what you would git clone a repository that you want to build. So let's just make a demo folder, cd demo, and then we clone the repository, and you will see it's a one-step build. So all I do is I open the solution. I could also build by command line. We have a section about building specifically in there, where you can, using PowerShell, just call this, and it's a two-step process if you want to build out the full module. So the first command is just going to build you out the C# code, and the second one is going to build you the docs if you want to export it as a proper module. And in an out folder, it will create you that, and then you can import it. So this is how you can build your Scratch if you want to use the latest version, because we're at the moment waiting for the next release. So I have Visual Studio open, I go build, and it does it for me. So it's very nicely much more simplified than it used to be. So the output is should be in an out folder if you can find it. No, because I've built via Visual Studio, so you would see it in I go to the rules folder, which is the lowest level dependency, and it would be as simple as going into the bin folder. You would import the module, ScriptAnalyzer.dll, and then you can already use it. This would be a very rough way of using it, but that's how simple it is. The proper way would be calling the two commands here, getting it from the output folder, and then you can put it into your profile module. Or as I do also, if you look at the VS Code installation in your user path, you could also replace it in here and use the latest version of PSScriptAnalyzer inside VS Code like this as well. Future directions is to get cross-platform support more serious, and also testing. As I said, there's a couple of tests that don't work on Linux yet. So Jim from Microsoft, known as James Struher, is mainly working on it. That's also where the direction from Microsoft came from. Now that PowerShell Core is cross-platform, they want to enhance the tool to make it easier to do certain analysis cross-platform as well, and that's why it has to work properly. At the moment, it's experimental. It works as you've seen in the demo, but probably there's a few bugs that need to be squashed. Bugs as well apply to rules and docs. There's loads of small and special cases that need to be considered. I briefly talked about PS Core compatibility. When you write a binary PowerShell module, you can use PowerShell Standard to know if it would work on Windows PowerShell or PowerShell Core. And the idea of PSScriptAnalyzer is to have the equivalent of PowerShell Standard for scripts. So there's going to be some more features about telling you compatibility across different versions of PowerShell Core. And new rules. If you want to suggest a rule, just open an issue, discuss it. I think in general, the more rules we add, the more useful the tool will get. And as I briefly mentioned, a single state analysis is going to be important to make PSScriptAnalyzer more intelligent, but it's a big thing to implement, so I don't know how long that will take. Thank you for your attention and patience. I hope I haven't talked too much about it. I've tried to cover loads of different aspects, tried going a bit more into details. To the time at the end, I found that I had to rush a bit through some of the details, like the custom rules. If there's any questions, feel free to ask.
I don't have any questions, Chris, but does anybody on the call or anybody on YouTube have any questions for Chris? No, I think we're all quiet. Oh,
Are you going to be at PSConf?
Yes, I'll be there.
Are you
I'll be there.
speaking?
Unfortunately not. I haven't submitted an application. Maybe I should have done. I am relatively new to the open source community, so I've started contributing to PowerShell core in last summer, I think, and PSScriptAnalyzer I've only started, I think, in November last year. So I've only been recently very active, only about since half a year ago. So that's why I didn't consider doing a presentation myself, but maybe next year.
You could always do a breakout session.
Didn't know. I will maybe look into that. So are people doing spontaneous breakout sessions at PSConf?
I think there were some. I think there were some things. I didn't actually go last year, but I think there were some things going on at lunchtimes occasionally.
Oh, that sounds good. Yeah. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to PSConf. I mean, 4 days of poshness.
Thanks very much for your presentation. It was really good.
Yeah, you're welcome. If you've got more questions, feel free to either ask me on GitHub, on Slack. I'm also on the UK Slack, Get PS UK Slack. I'm on Twitter, sometimes more, sometimes less. I'm happy to help you out a bit if you have certain feature requests. I'm happy to do a bit of stuff. I'm happy to help you out if you want to write some of the stuff yourself, because I really want to get a bit more community support in the PSScriptAnalyzer so that people actually contribute to it as well. I see a lot of people are already contributing to the discussions, but I think in order to move the tool forward, it would be much better if we could all work together as a community and get the tool a bit more up to scratch. So I'd be very open to, if you want to learn how to debug and build PSScriptAnalyzer yourself, I would be very open to help you a bit out to get you started.
excellent. Thank you very much for that, Chris. Much appreciated. I use PowerShell ScriptAnalyzer quite a lot, probably like a lot of the other guys. So actually learning more about it is great. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Well, thanks, guys. That is the end. We've just run over by a couple of minutes. That's the end of our meetup this month. Something I meant to mention at the beginning was there's two other groups in the kind of Glasgow area. There's SQL Glasgow that's going on. I believe you have a meeting on Thursday, Craig. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Tomorrow night.
Yeah. I meant to actually put these in the slides at the beginning. I've also got the Azure one, which I'll be honest, I don't know when the dates for that is, but please check out the Azure Glasgow PowerShell, the Azure Glasgow group as well. There is also one in Edinburgh. Yeah, check them out. I'll need to get dates for them for next month so that I can actually put them on the slides. Because I'm keen to get and promote any of the Scottish groups as much as possible. So thank you very much, Chris. Thank you to Mathias, who's not on the call anymore. That's all, as I said, for this month. We will be back on the 25th. Paul's just going to double check that it's 25th. And is it? Yes, it is. We're back on the 25th of April. And sorry, I'm just doing something. There we go. Yeah, we're back on the 25th of April. And then, as I said at the beginning, we have a physical meetup for May, so we'll see how that goes as well. I'm going to drop out a survey tomorrow after the call. Tomorrow after. I'm going to try and get the presentations today onto YouTube. I think this was a fantastic one. Not to say the other ones weren't, but I'm just going to push myself tomorrow to try and get this one onto YouTube properly. I know we're doing it live just now, but I'm going to get the video on there as well. So thanks to everybody for that. So look out tomorrow for an email from me with a survey and details of this going up on YouTube. So thank you very much, guys, and I shall see you all next month.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.